It may have died in name, but its breath lingers in laws, languages, flags, borders, and minds. The British Empire, once the largest the world has ever known, officially ended decades ago. And yet, you can still feel its echo in the courtrooms of Delhi, in the railways of Africa, in the school books of Jamaica, in the parliaments of Australia. It is a tale of systems, of institutions, of culture, repackaged as universal truth. In this series, we will trace the fingerprints of the British Empire in the modern world, from the City of London, its control of global finance, to the schooling systems that shape future leaders, to the borders still bleeding conflict where imperial cartographers once drew lines. Unlike Rome, which fell to swords and fire, the British Empire retreated behind treaties, declarations, and handovers. In Africa, legal systems mimic the structures of Westminster, a pivot from overt dominance to covert guidance. Colonialism by another name. Soft power. The Commonwealth, formed in 1931, maintains the framework of a voluntary imperial family, yet Britain remains its central figure. Today, it is the most widely spoken second language on Earth. The coronation of King Charles III in 2023 still featured regalia, rooted in colonial conquest, diamonds mined in India and South Africa, robes stitched from symbols of empire. Over $18 trillion are managed in British overseas territories, tax havens that owe their very existence to imperial convenience. Not because of its beauty, but because of British and later American imperial force. The language of commerce, science, diplomacy set the rules of global engagement. Flags changed, parliaments formed, constitutions drafted, but the blueprint of empire remained embedded in the world. The empire's most effective trick was not its conquest, but the systems it left behind. Bureaucracies, borders, schools, laws. Its walls may no longer fly Union Jacks, but we still live inside its design. British officials, led by Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India and knew little of its complexities, were tasked with drawing the borders between Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 supported a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine without consulting the Arab population. Simultaneously, Britain supported Arab independence to weaken the Ottomans. These conflicting pledges, made under colonial opportunism, laid the groundwork for one of the most intractable conflicts of the modern era, the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The result was a rushed partition that displaced over 15 million people and led to the deaths of more than 1 million in communal violence. The India-Pakistan border remains one of the most volatile on Earth, with 3 wars fought and a nuclear standoff continuing to this day. These systems continue to operate long after Independence Days are celebrated with flags and fireworks. Even the air we breathe online, crafted in English, ordered by legal systems. It's governed by structures of power that began in London, whispers the legacy of empire. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, where European powers, led by Britain, carved up Africa without a single African present, imposed arbitrary national borders. These borders ignored ethnic, cultural, and linguistic realities. Today, many African civil wars and political crises are the direct result of colonial borders. Apologies are rare, reparations nearly non-existent. What does it mean for a civilization to persist after its formal end? The Biafran War, which killed over 1 million people, was rooted in these divisions. The legacy of forced unity still haunts its politics. Their borders and economies were designed for empire, not independence. Streets and cities retain names chosen by colonizers. Victoria Island, Kingstown, Port Elizabeth. Lines drawn in sand across jungles, through deserts, over mountains, by men in suits in faraway London. With compasses and pens, they created nations. And in doing so, they also created conflict. Why do nations that declared independence still walk paths paved by their colonizer? And who truly benefits or suffers from this invisible empire? This is not just a story of conquest and glory. That was the boast of the British Empire at its zenith by 1922. It ruled over 458 million people, more than 1/5 of the world's population. 1/4 of the Earth's landmass bowed to the British crown. Its navy mastered the seas, its merchants mastered trade, and its culture was spread as doctrine. But what happens when an empire so vast ends? 25 deep explorations. One living empire. This is how the British Empire still shapes our world today, on which the sun never set. The dissolution of the British Empire was not a singular event. In India, the penal code drafted under British rule still underpins criminal law. In this first section, we explore how the British Empire never quite fell, but rather transitioned. Consider the legacy of English. London, too, still looms large. Not just as a capital, but as a hub of global finance. And then there's the monarchy. While stripped of most of its direct political influence, it remains a symbol, a living reminder of Britain's imperial past. Former colonies still send troops to train in Sandhurst. Legal professionals earn prestige through British titles. This is not merely nostalgia, it is structure. Some benefit, others bear scars. To understand how the British Empire still shapes the world, we must stop seeing it as history and start recognizing it as architecture. One of the most enduring and violent legacies of the British Empire lies not in language, but in lines, borders. The partition of India in 1947 is one of the starkest examples. In the Middle East, British promises to Arabs and Jews clashed tragically. Africa, too, bears the mapmaker's wounds. Nigeria, for example, groups together hundreds of distinct ethnicities, including the Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo, into one artificial nation. In the Caribbean, the colonial plantation economy forged small island nations heavily reliant on monoculture exports and vulnerable to global shifts. Britain has not always acknowledged this inheritance. It's unlike Germany, which openly apologizes for its colonial atrocities in Namibia. The British government has often avoided formal acknowledgement, but these borders remain, their consequences active. Wars, refugee crises, stateless people born of lines drawn without consent. In a world of more than 7,000 spoken languages, one dominates above all: English, not because it is ancient nor inherently superior, but because it was enforced, adopted, and entrenched by empire. The spread of English was never accidental, it was strategic. The British Empire at its height installed English as the language of law, of governance, of education, of trade. To learn English was to access power. To speak English was to be civilized, so said the textbooks and colonial administrators. Today, India is one of the largest English-speaking nations in the world. Only now are these dialects being reclaimed with pride, recognized as legitimate linguistic identities, forged under the fires of enslavement and colonization. Children were taken from their families, placed in boarding schools where only English could be spoken. Language became a weapon. English is the language of its courts, higher education, and elite business circles. It remains a class divider. Those fluent in English often have access to better jobs and greater influence. A student in Brazil must learn English to access top journals. A scientist in Cameroon must publish in English to be recognized. A worker in the Philippines must perfect a British accent for a call center job. In India, the Macaulay Minute of 1835 declared that the goal of education was to create a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. When maps were redrawn, not by geography or history, but by imperial will, the so-called Queen's English is valorized, while regional and immigrant dialects are often stigmatized. It unites diverse populations but also displaces indigenous tongues. Children are often punished in school for speaking their native language. Entire cultures are lost in translation. English common law, civil codes, and colonial ordinances were exported as part of the civilizing mission, Section 377, which criminalized homosexuality, was introduced by the British, and remained in place until 2018. Customary law was tolerated only when it did not contradict imperial rule. This dual system fractured trust and justice and persists in post-colonial courts today. Bar associations modeled themselves after London's Inns of Court. In some countries, the Privy Council in the UK remains the final court of appeal despite local Supreme Courts existing. British colonial law, designed to regulate the morality of its subjects, policed not just crime but identity. After emancipation, plantation owners found in British legal protections a way to retain power. Laws were used to restrict movement, control labor, and limit economic opportunity for black and brown populations. In societies built on community negotiation and oral tradition, the British-style adversarial system can seem cold, rigid, and inaccessible. Laws prohibited strikes, censored speech, criminalized gatherings, and punish dissent. These aren't local inventions. They are colonial inheritances. In South Africa, the post-apartheid constitution draws on British law but infuses it with indigenous values and human rights. Where its armies marched, its statutes followed. English common law, civil codes, and colonial ordinances were exported as part of the civilizing mission. Section 377, which criminalized homosexuality, was introduced by the British and remained in place until 2018. British colonial law, designed to regulate the morality of its subjects, policed not just crime, but identity. These laws restructured entire societies, not always to ensure justice, but to ensure control. Legal English verbose and alienates the people it is supposed to serve. The letter of the law remains, but not always its spirit. Many judges and lawyers train in the UK. Bar associations modeled themselves after London's Inns of Court. Laws prohibited strikes, censored speech, criminalized gatherings, and punished dissent. Colonial prisons overflowed not with criminals, but with freedom fighters. In some countries, the Privy Council in the UK remains the final court of appeal, despite local Supreme Courts existing.
Ow.
In South Africa, the post-apartheid constitution draws on British law but infuses it with indigenous values and human rights. But they also carry assumptions about hierarchy, culture, and authority that may not fit every society. In India, public interest litigation has become a powerful democratic tool, transforming colonial courts into platforms for reform. Customary law was tolerated only when it did not contradict imperial rule. After emancipation, plantation owners found in British legal protections a way to retain power. Laws were used to restrict movement, control labor, and limit economic opportunity for black and brown populations. This dual system fractured trust in justice and persists in post-colonial courts today. In India, public interest litigation has become a powerful democratic tool, transforming colonial courts into platforms for reform. Colonial prisons overflowed not with criminals, but with freedom fighters. Legal English verbose and archaic alienates the people it is supposed to serve. The letter of the law remains, but not always its spirit. These laws restructured entire societies, not always to ensure justice, but to ensure control. When one language is imposed globally, it carries with it the cultural logic of its origin. English is not just words, it is a worldview, a colonial memory stitched into every syllable. English was not simply taught. It was used to reshape minds. That legacy continues. But they also carry assumptions about hierarchy, culture, and authority that may not fit every society. Across Africa, the same pattern persists. In Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and beyond, English is the official language not of the people, but of the state. These aren't local inventions. They're colonial inheritances. The Caribbean presents a different variant where English is the mother tongue, yet it evolved into creoles and patois, dismissed for generations as broken English. In former settler colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, English was the tool of cultural erasure. Indigenous languages were criminalized. It is the language of international law, science, diplomacy, academia, air traffic control, and the internet. Over 60% of the internet's content is in English, even though only 5% of the world speaks it natively. The global dominance of English is now embedded in the structures of globalization, but here lies the imperial twist. The hegemony of English benefits the few, while demanding linguistic labor from the many. Even within the United Kingdom, accents still serve as indicators of class and credibility. The British Empire may no longer govern through armies, but it continues to govern through grammar. Language is not neutral. It carries power, worldviews, histories. We often speak of globalization as modern, but in truth, it began when British ships reached foreign shores. As long as those borders exist, as long as their makers remain unaccountable, the empire still casts its shadow. Walk into a courtroom in Delhi, Lagos, or Kingston, and the scene may feel oddly familiar. Black robes, wooden gavels, the ritualistic order of my lord, and an adversarial legal structure. One of the most lasting tools of the British Empire was the law. Where its armies marched, its statutes followed. In India, the Indian Penal Code, drafted in 1860, still forms the backbone of criminal law. In Africa, colonial legal systems criminalized indigenous customs, placed community arbitration with rigid court procedures, and prioritized property law that favored white settlers. Even in the Caribbean, the British imposed legal systems that were alien to the enslaved and indentured. Across Commonwealth countries today, legal education is still based on British case law. Many judges and lawyers train in the UK, but these borrowed systems come with contradictions. Moreover, British law under empire was never fully about justice. It was about maintaining order and order favorable to the empire. Today, activists in former colonies often cite the same legal systems that once imprisoned their ancestors to demand justice and equality. The legacy of British legal systems is complex. They provide structure, precedent, and institutional continuity. To decolonize law is not necessarily to discard it, but to interrogate it, to ask whose justice, whose language, whose values, to remember that even the most seemingly neutral systems can bear the imprint of empire. Walk into a courtroom in Delhi, Lagos, or Kingston. The scene may feel oddly familiar. Black robes, wooden gavels, the ritualistic order of my lord, and an adversarial legal structure. One of the most lasting tools of the British Empire was the law. In India, the Indian Penal Code, drafted in 1860, still forms the backbone of criminal law. In Africa, colonial legal systems criminalized indigenous customs, replaced community arbitration with rigid court procedures, and prioritized property law that favored white settlers. Even in the Caribbean, the British imposed legal systems that were alien to the enslaved and indentured. Across Commonwealth countries today, legal education is still based on British case law, but these borrowed systems come with contradictions. In societies built on community negotiation and oral tradition, the British-style adversarial system can seem cold, rigid, and inaccessible. Moreover, British law under empire was never fully about justice. It was about maintaining order and order favorable to the empire. Today, activists in former colonies often cite the same legal systems that once imprisoned their ancestors to demand justice and equality. The legacy of British legal systems is complex. They provide structure, precedent, and institutional continuity. To decolonize law is not necessarily to discard it, but to interrogate it, to ask whose justice, whose language, whose values, and to remember that even the most seemingly neutral systems can bear the imprint of empire. Independence, many former colonies believed, would usher in prosperity. With the Union Jack lowered and new flags raised, a brighter economic future seemed within reach. But what many soon realized was this: independence had changed the names, not the systems. The economics of empire endured, in some cases deepened. Debts accumulated under colonial rule were often transferred to the new states. They inherited monetary systems pegged to sterling, trade agreements favoring Britain, and economies reliant on a single exportee. Sugar, rubber, cocoa, or cotton set at prices determined abroad. Colonialism was never simply about land or culture. It was fundamentally an economic enterprise. A former colony might receive loans or grants on the condition that they purchase goods or services from Britain. These structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 90s gutted public services in countries across Africa, Caribbean, and South Asia, widening inequality. In South Africa, the mining sector still reflects the racial and economic hierarchies birthed under imperial rule. These islands, with tiny populations, serve as global hubs for illicit finance and corporate secrecy, legacies of an empire that once thrived on offshore wealth. This created a dependency loop. Aid meant to empower often reinforced the very structures it claimed to dismantle. Shell, Unilever, Barclays, these are not just brands but legacies. Regional blocs like CARICOM and the African Union are pushing for greater economic self-determination. But to confront that ghost, we must first recognize its presence and understand how empire learned to profit even after it appeared to leave. It's not Westminster. It's not Buckingham Palace. It is the City of London. Movements for reparative justice, such as CARICOM's 10-point plan for reparations, are reframing colonialism not as history, but as unpaid debt. But more crucially, it is the command center of a network of satellite financial outposts. The British overseas territories and crown dependencies. Former colonies are caught in a cycle, borrowing to meet basic needs, then repaying with interest that drains future potential. While technically separate from the UK, they retain the Queen's portrait on currency and often defer to British law. London benefits from their opacity, serving as the final destination for much of this offshore capital. The legal mechanisms, secrecy laws, and trade networks that empower the city were built during the empire's height. They allowed Britain to control wealth globally, and they still do. Trillions of dollars are funneled through these jurisdictions, largely under the watchful eye and legal influence of Britain. How? Because empire was never just about land, it was about liquidity. It is the beating heart of an economic empire that never dissolved. It simply rebranded. Why? Because this is not a bug in the post-imperial system. It is the system. Resources were extracted. Labor was exploited. Infrastructure was designed not for local development, but to serve imperial commerce. Look at where it flows, where it stops, and who gets to control its path. Former colonies send capital here, knowingly or not. African dictators stash billions, Asian oligarchs buy real estate. Caribbean financial flows pass through empty shell companies. Railways led to ports, not to villages. Cash crops replaced food crops. Education prepared clerks, not entrepreneurs. The financial secrecy and deregulation that define the city echo the colonial practices of operating beyond oversight. And when decolonization came, it came with strings. It predates the empire, yet became its engine. In the 18th and 19th centuries, London's bankers funded colonial ventures, underwrote slaving expeditions, and insured plantations. It was in London that fortunes were made from faraway suffering. The concept of development aid arose in this context, but often aid was tied. International financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, ostensibly neutral, often promoted policies privatization, deregulation, austerity that echoed colonial economic doctrines. In countries like Jamaica, Ghana, and Pakistan, debt repayments regularly eclipsed spending on health and education. Meanwhile, British and multinational corporations, many with roots in the colonial era, continue to dominate sectors like mining, agriculture, and banking. In India, tea plantations established by the British remain structured around exploitative labor. Tax havens, many located in British overseas territories like the Cayman Islands or British Virgin Islands, facilitate the siphoning of wealth from former colonies. This is the architecture of economic empire: dependency without dominion, inequality without accountability. Yet amid this bleak landscape, former colonies are also resisting. The British Empire's economic ghost haunts trade routes, currency systems, commodity markets, and debt ledgers. While the empire's physical territories have faded from the map, one imperial fortress remains untouched, its walls built not of stone but of finance. This square mile at the heart of Britain's capital is one of the most powerful financial districts in the world. But it's more than a financial center. The city, with its own ancient laws, Lord Mayor, and police force, is a peculiar anomaly. Today, the city remains a global hub for foreign exchange, insurance, and banking. Places like the Cayman Islands, Jersey, and Bermuda aren't just vacation spots. They're pillars of the offshore finance world. These tax havens allow multinational corporations and wealthy individuals to avoid taxes, hide assets, and shelter wealth. The modern city of London acts as a post-imperial metropolitan of territory but of money. This system is not an accident, it's an inheritance. Consider this. Britain is no longer a global manufacturing power, yet London remains one of the richest cities in the world. Critics have called this the spider's web, a tangled financial structure that captures wealth from across the globe, concentrates it in London, and keeps it largely untaxed and unaccountable. Transparency advocates like Nicholas Shaxson have warned that the city's influence poses a threat not just to tax justice, but to democracy itself. While British citizens grapple with austerity, rising living costs, and underfunded services, London's skyline tells another story: of billionaire wealth parked in empty penthouses, of anonymous corporations buying up infrastructure, of an empire that adapted instead of ending. And through it all, the British state rarely intervenes. To understand the British Empire today, don't just look at maps, look at money. When we speak of the British Empire, we often think of redcoats and tropical lands, trading posts on coasts, and administrators in faraway palaces. but some of its most enduring legacies lie in lands where the British did not just rule, but settled. Lands they claimed not only to govern, but to populate, dominate, and remake in their own image. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, the United States before independence. Aboriginal peoples were excluded from law, land rights, and later even the census. The stolen generations' children taken from their families to be raised as white Tremaines, one of the most haunting scars of this policy. These were not simply colonies, they were settler colonies. And in them, the empire left behind more than governance. It left behind whiteness as a ruling structure. Generations of First Nations and Inuit children were removed from their families, forbidden to speak their languages, punished for practicing their culture. Or Canada's historic bans on Chinese immigration and its head tax system. These weren't accidental policies, they were the racial scaffolding of empire. In these territories, indigenous peoples were not merely subjugated, they were displaced, dispossessed, and in many cases, subjected to systematic attempts at erasure. Indigenous communities and settler colonies face higher rates of incarceration, poverty, and health disparity. Land rights battles continue. Cultural recognition remains piecemeal. In Australia, the monarchy remains the formal head of state. In Canada, the Queen's or now King's representative signs laws into effect. Through forced removals, massacres, and assimilation programs, Britain built new Britons atop ancient civilizations. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, land-back movements, indigenous languages being revived all challenged the imperial inheritance. But the reckoning remains incomplete. These societies were not just racially divided, they were racially constructed. British literature replaced local epics. Shakespeare supplanted Kalidasa. Children learned about Wordsworth, not Kabir. Colonial classrooms replaced oral tradition with rote memorization of British facts and fables. Empire was portrayed as benevolent, colonization a gift. The violence of conquest was omitted, and indigenous knowledge systems were dismissed as superstition. Indigenous children were taken from their homes, placed in residential or mission schools, and stripped of language, culture, identity. Education became a tool of cultural genocide. The laws, borders, education systems, and even immigration policies favored one race above all others. Admission to Oxford or Cambridge is still seen as the apex of educational achievement in many post-colonial societies. The curriculum taught pride in the Union Jack, but shame in one's own skin. Colonial grammar books continue to shape the way millions learn language. The accents of colonizers still open doors that local dialects do not. Scholars are challenging Eurocentric epistemologies and reviving traditional knowledge. Systems from Ayurveda to African cosmologies, school uniforms, morning assemblies, head boys and prefects, remnants of a British schooling model transplanted across continents. But not local poets, the empire lives on not through conquest, but through curriculum. It taught obedience, hierarchy, and reverence for the crown. The British way of life was presented as the pinnacle of civilization, its literature, its laws, its heroes. Everything else was inferior, tribal, backward. The histories of empire, if taught at all, are often sanitized. Britain appears not as aggressor, but as administrator. And who gets to be fully included in the promises of citizenship? Minds had to be molded, values had to be taught. Histories had to be rewritten or erased, and for that, they turned to education. They were test grounds for white supremacy, institutionalized racism, and the logic that race could and should dictate power. In Australia, the policy of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, was a legal fiction used to justify colonial takeover. In Canada, the residential school system, founded and funded under imperial logic, came to kill the Indian and the child. The racial segregation passed laws, and property exclusions of the early British Cape Colony directly influenced the later system of institutionalized white supremacy. In South Africa, British colonists laid the groundwork for what would become apartheid. What united all these settler colonies was a common imperial ideology: whiteness as civilization and non-whiteness as obstruction. Consider the White Australia policy, a set of laws designed to keep non-white immigrants out. Even today, echoes of this hierarchy remain. Meanwhile, political institutions, parliaments, courts, bureaucracies still largely reflect the structures imported by Britain. Yet resistance is powerful. The British Empire's settler colonies were not footnotes. They were foundations. Today, we must ask, in these nations that pride themselves on freedom and democracy, how deep does the empire still run? Empire begins with guns, but it endures through books. The British Empire understood that to sustain power, it was not enough to build railways or write laws. Colonial schooling was never neutral. Its aim was not to cultivate free thinkers, but compliant subjects. In India, Lord Macaulay's infamous 1835 Minute on Education made clear the imperial mission: to create intermediaries, Indians who thought and spoke like Englishmen. Across Africa, the pattern was similar. In the Caribbean, enslaved and formerly enslaved populations were taught that their history began with British rule. African heritage was sidelined and black achievements erased. Even in the settler colonies, education was an engine of assimilation. And these patterns did not end with independence. Today, across former colonies, British education systems still dominate. GCSEs in Jamaica, O-levels in Kenya, English literature in Indian universities. Former colonies often send their brightest students to study in Britain, perpetuating a brain drain that benefits the metropole. The idea of proper English remains deeply tied to intelligence and social mobility. More subtly, British educational values, individualism, rationalism, Western-centric worldviews are embedded in curricula worldwide. But resistance is growing. Decolonizing education has become a global movement. Students demand inclusive syllabi, histories from the margins, and recognition of the violence underpinning civilization. Universities across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean are reintroducing indigenous texts, philosophers, and frameworks. Education, once a colonial tool, is becoming a site of emancipation. But the struggle is ongoing. For as long as a child in Ghana learns that civilization began with the British, or a student in Pakistan studies colonial governors, the empire taught its subjects to memorize British greatness. Now we must teach ourselves to remember what came before and imagine what could come after. Empire ruled with a sword in one hand and a Bible in the other. From the earliest days of British colonization, religion was inseparable from conquest. Christianity, particularly in its Protestant and Anglican forms, became not only the faith of the empire, but its justification. To civilize the world, the British said, was to save its soul. In the 18th and 19th centuries, missionaries followed traders, soldiers, and administrators into Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. They established churches, built schools, translated scriptures, and baptized millions. But these acts were not simply spiritual. They were deeply political. Indigenous religions were framed as pagan, savage, or demonic. Ancestor worship, animism, and syncretic beliefs were demonized or banned. By the late 19th century, British colonial authorities often relied on Christian converts to serve as intermediaries, teachers, clerks, police. The church and the crown worked hand in hand. Mission schools became sites of cultural erasure, where local languages were suppressed and British morality installed. Conversion was often the precondition for education, healthcare, and upward mobility. Churches built by missionaries still dominate skylines in Nairobi, Accra, and Port of Spain. Prosperity gospel preachers now echo imperial ideals of discipline, hierarchy, and obedience, dressed in modern robes. Christian holidays are national holidays in secular states. Laws on marriage, sexuality, and gender, often rooted in Victorian Christian morality, remain enshrined in post-colonial constitutions. In Uganda, Nigeria, India, and beyond, Christianity became a tool of soft colonization. Their ancestral faiths, Yoruba, Vodun, were criminalized, yet resistance endured. In Haiti, Cuba, and Brazil, enslaved people disguised their gods as Catholic saints, preserving belief under surveillance. Empire could not extinguish spirit. From the trenches of Flanders to the hills of Burma, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Malaya, the empire's borders were held and expanded by force. But its armies were not solely British. They were often conscripts or volunteers bound by duty, poverty, or loyalty to a crown that never truly saw them as equals. In World War II, that number rose even higher. In 1948, the British government welcomed ex-servicemen from the Caribbean aboard the Empire Windrush, only to later deport their descendants decades later. British military doctrine shapes the armed forces of Kenya, India, Pakistan, and many others. Ceremonial uniforms, ranking systems, and regimental structures are direct inheritances of empire. Troops from Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, the Caribbean, Nepal, and beyond served across the world. The British Empire didn't just deploy its military, it outsourced it. Indian troops suppressed rebellions in Sudan. African soldiers were used to quell uprisings in other African colonies. The British model of control often relied on divided loyalties, creating ethnically segmented forces, trained to suppress their own. Anglicanism, with its hierarchy, rituals, and ties to monarchy, became the blueprint for orderly Christian society. The colonial police weren't public servants, they were instruments of surveillance and repression. Crowd control, detention without trial, surveillance, all part of the empire's global playbook. Today, police brutality in some post-colonial states echoes the colonial tactics once used to suppress dissent. It's about how uniforms became symbols of order and of oppression. Veterans' descendants campaign for justice, recognition, and historical truth. Civil wars in Nigeria, Sri Lanka, and Sudan carry the fingerprints of empire often armed, at least in part, by their former rulers. Often invisible in war memorials, absent from Western history books, they were nonetheless the backbone of imperial might. The Church of England exported a model of authority that mirrored imperial governance. The empire was careful, too, to reshape religion in its own image. But religion also became a method of control. It created rigid definitions of caste and Sharia that never existed in such form before. These official versions of faith, frozen by colonial logic, later fueled sectarian division and legal complications. In India, British administrators, while promoting Christianity, also reinterpreted and codified Hinduism and Islam in colonial courts. In the Caribbean and Americas, enslaved Africans were forced to convert. Today, the legacy of religious colonialism remains visible. In many African nations, evangelical Christianity descended from colonial missions has surged in political influence. But resistance continues. Indigenous spiritualities are being revived. Traditional ceremonies return. Faith is no longer one-way conversion, but reclamation, syncretic, plural, decolonized. Empire used religion to shape the soul of its subjects. Today, the soul fights back. We must remember, while belief may be sacred, its history is often political. Under empire, even salvation served a crown. The story of the British Empire is written in blood. Millions of colonial subjects fought and died under the Union Jack. During World War I, over 1.5 million Indian soldiers fought for Britain. Gurkhas from Nepal, Sikhs and Rajputs from India, West African Frontier Force regiments, Caribbean engineers and medics. These were not mercenaries. Despite their service, these soldiers were often underpaid, denied pensions, or excluded from post-war benefits. But beyond wars, the Empire's military legacy remains institutional. British training colleges like Sandhurst continue to educate officers from across the Commonwealth, but so are the darker traditions. Colonial militaries were often used not against foreign enemies, but against local populations. Police systems, too, were militarized under colonial rule.
Ow.
In Northern Ireland, British military tactics, tested during colonial campaigns, like those in Palestine or Kenya, were repurposed. And what of the weapons left behind? Many post-colonial conflicts were fueled by British arms, British training, British borders. Yet, amid this legacy, there is resilience. Former colonies now lead peacekeeping missions. Soldiers once denied honor are now remembered in books, documentaries, and commemorations. But remembrance is not enough. The Empire's military legacy is not just about war, it's about how violence was normalized, racialized, and institutionalized. The British Empire left behind armies, bases, and medals, but it also left behind wounds open, unresolved, and often unspoken. The image is iconic. A monarch crowned beneath a golden canopy, draped in robes of ermine and silk, bearing an orb, a scepter, and a crown encrusted with colonial jewels. But history tells a different story. Monarchs presided over colonization, endorsed charters of conquest, profited from slavery, and gave legitimacy to the empire's expansion. Kings and queens offered medals to generals who crushed uprisings or signed orders that reshaped entire nations. The monarchy was woven into the very fabric of colonial legitimacy. The crown was not a passive figurehead, it was an active benefactor of empire. To many, the British monarchy is a quaint tradition, a national spectacle of pageantry. But to others, it is something far more profound and more painful, a living symbol of colonial rule. Despite its name, real wealth economic, cultural, institutional remains far from common. The Kohinoor diamond from India, the Cullinan from South Africa, rubies, sapphires, emeralds all, taken or gifted under imperial pressure. To millions, they are not heirlooms, they are trophies. The Queen's personal wealth, much of it accumulated during the empire's height, remains opaque and largely tax-free. But resistance remains. The monarchy, much like the empire, thrives on ceremony, control, and denial. The king's portrait adorns currency. Oaths of allegiance are still sworn to the crown in courts, legislatures, and public offices. The symbolic presence remains potent. They point to the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of 56 nations once under British rule, supposedly equal partners. They argue the monarchy helps maintain diplomatic and cultural ties. Raised questions long suppressed. Should we continue to honor a monarchy that stood atop centuries of exploitation? Should independence mean full sovereignty, not symbolic allegiance? Barbados formally removed the monarch as head of state in 2021, declaring itself a republic. Other nations, Jamaica, Antigua, Belize, have signaled similar intentions. Jane Austen's idyllic countryside rarely acknowledges the wealth extracted from slave colonies. Brown and black characters become sidekicks, servants, or silent extras. The imperial gaze lingers. Rudyard Kipling's rhymes whisper of the white man's burden. The BBC, once the empire's voice, still reaches across continents. Its accent, tone, and editorial framing often carry subtle assumptions about civility, modernity, and British moral authority. Shakespeare, Dickens, Orwell-worthy writers, but often taught without context. Coverage of conflicts in former colonies often lacks historical context. Yet their halls echo with empire, yet plaques offer little truth. But with every exported show, every sold-out tour, the empire subtly reinforces its cultural dominance. Hashtags like hashtag Rhodes must fall and hashtag DECOLONIZE, everything call out monuments, museums, and media that glorify colonialism. Uprisings are framed as instability, not resistance. Economic crises are blamed on corruption, not colonial legacies. Writers from across the former empire, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Aaron Dottie, Roy, Andrea Leviar, reclaiming narrative power. Filmmakers, playwrights, and musicians are retelling history from the margins, turning silence into speech. The empire's fingerprints are erased from the lens. The colonized world reads the colonizer's words as default, while local authors fight for space. Winston Churchill is lionized, his colonial atrocities rarely discussed. The calls grow louder. It is time to leave the colonial crown behind. The British royal family has long claimed to be above politics, not always as history, but as nostalgia, not as critique, but as comfort. Queen Elizabeth I backed the early voyages of the slave trade. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. Even today, the monarch remains the head of state in 14 nations beyond Britain, from Canada to Papua New Guinea. Series like The Crown, Downton Abbey, and Victoria present British imperialism as a backdrop, lavish, dignified, sanitized. Rarely do they explore the violence, racism, and resistance at the empire's core. In 2022, the death of Queen Elizabeth II ignited a global reckoning. While millions mourned a beloved figurehead, many others, particularly in former colonies in the Caribbean, these questions became action. Yet defenders of the monarchy insisted as a force for unity. But critics see the Commonwealth differently. Not a family of equals, but a symbolic echo of empire. The crown jewels, too, are a source of controversy. Calls for restitution grow. Museums, palaces, and private collections face pressure to return artifacts looted or acquired during colonial rule. To dismantle empire, some argue, is to dismantle its symbols. And none is more enduring than the crown. So we must ask, is the monarchy merely ceremonial? Or is it the golden thread still tying today's world to yesterday's dominion? Empire may have withdrawn its armies, but the monarch remains seated. And until the scepter is set down, the shadow of the empire will always linger. The empire no longer commands navies or draws maps, but it still tells the stories. From the classrooms of Lagos to the cinema screens of Mumbai, from Netflix dramas to BBC documentaries, the British Empire remains alive in the cultural imagination. British culture, exported and revered, often carries with it the myths of empire. These narratives shape how empire is remembered and how it is forgotten. In television, empire is often reduced to aesthetic, the uniforms, the aristocracy, the manners. Even when colonial settings are shown into the Caribbean, Africa, they are often through British eyes. Literature, the British canon dominates school curricula around the world. The media, too, has been shaped by empire. This extends to journalism. Cultural institutions like the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum are filled with artifacts, many of them taken during war, conquest, or coercion. Meanwhile, British popular culture thrives abroad. From fashion to pop music, theater to advertising, the English aesthetic remains aspirational in many parts of the world. Yet this legacy is now being challenged. Decolonizing the curriculum has become a demand in universities from Cape Town to Oxford. Social media, too, has become a battleground for memory. Culture is not innocent. It is a battlefield of meaning, a repository of power. And the British Empire, even in death, remains one of its most prolific authors. So the next time we watch a period drama or read a classic novel, we must ask whose story is being told, and whose silence makes that story possible. For empire, like all empires, survives not just through conquest, but through myth. Empire found many ways to assert its order. Some were violent, others subtle. And few were more enduring, or more symbolic than sport. In the colonies, sport was never just a game. It was a tool of cultural control, a mechanism for hierarchy, and sometimes unexpectedly a vehicle for rebellion. Imported from Britain as a gentleman's pastime, cricket was meant to civilize. Its structure, long, rule-bound, and polite, was said to reflect the British moral code. To play cricket was to aspire to Britishness. The white colonial elite controlled access, and players of African and Indian descent had to wait generations before donning the West Indies cap. In South Africa, apartheid extended to cricket, creating a white-only national team while black players remained in the shadows. Cricket stands as the most potent symbol. In India, the West Indies, South Africa, and Australia, colonial administrators built pitches, formed clubs, and enforced racial exclusivity. For decades, people of color were either excluded or made to play in separate inferior leagues. In the Caribbean, cricket clubs were racially segregated, yet cricket also became a paradox. Today, their players fill the rosters of wealthy Western clubs, often migrating due to limited opportunities at home. The spread of football clubs across Africa, Asia, and Latin America owes much to British colonial enterprise. Today's mega clubs still tour former colonies, sell kits, and recruit talent from the global south, while the wealth flows back to Europe. They challenge colonial anthems, call out racist abuse, demand justice beyond the field. The same applies to Kenyan runners or Caribbean sprinters. Excellence born from post-colonial struggle, exported for profit. The idea that talent alone dictates success. But beneath the surface lie structural inequalities shaped by centuries of extraction and neglect. What was meant to subjugate eventually empowered. Colonized peoples mastered the game and then beat the colonizer at it. When Pakistan triumphed in World Cups, each match became more than a game, it became a reckoning. From the Caribbean came the Windrush generation. From South Asia came doctors, engineers, and laborers. From Africa came students and workers. Housing discrimination, job exclusions, racist policing, and tabloid fear-mongering marked their welcome. Politicians like Enoch Powell warned of rivers of blood. Right-wing movements rose, and yet the reality was more complex. They arrived not as foreigners, but as citizens of the Commonwealth. British citizens, many who had lived in the UK for decades, were suddenly detained, deported, or denied services. Their documents lost, their rights ignored. All because the empire that once claimed them no longer wished to remember them. In politics, the presence of diverse faces often masks the absence of structural change. It allowed the colonized to turn the colonizers' tool against them, to challenge assumptions of racial superiority, to assert pride on a global stage. Irish rebels and Indian nationalists alike moved through London's heart. British teams continue to wield disproportionate influence. English cricket maintains elitist structures, where private schools dominate talent pipelines and race remains a divisive issue. It crafted elaborate myths about European superiority, embedding them into education, science, religion, and governance. They force a reckoning. What does it mean to be British in a post-imperial world? Who decides that story? And while the colonies gained independence, these ideas never truly left the metropole. When India defeated England at Lord's, when the West Indies dominated the pitch in the 1970s and 80s, led by firebrands like Viv Richards and Clive Lloyd, sport became protest in disguise, yet colonial legacies persist. The International Cricket Council, headquartered in Dubai, still reflects hierarchical structures established during empire. Beyond cricket, other sports tell similar stories. They are all racialized, all imperial, all deeply political. Rugby in the Pacific Islands, Fiji, Tonga. Samoa was introduced by missionaries and imperial officers. And then there's football, the global game, but one deeply shaped by imperial roots. Sport has become one of the empire's most enduring myths of meritocracy. Still, resistance grows. Athletes now speak out. They kneel. They protest. Sport remains a battlefield of memory and meaning. And just like empire, it's never just a game. Empire shaped the world, but it also shaped Britain itself. The British Empire was built on racial hierarchy. It justified conquest by declaring some peoples civilized and others savage. Today, British identity remains entangled with empire, and race remains its uncomfortable mirror. After World War II, Britain invited migrants from across the empire to help rebuild the nation. Yet they were met not with gratitude, but suspicion. The myth of a white Britain, under siege by immigration, took root. Britain was never homogeneous. Its empire had brought people together for centuries. Sailors from Bengal in the 18th century, African servants in Victorian households. But after empire, race became a boundary marker, a way of policing who belonged. The Windrush scandal of the 2010s laid bare this contradiction. Britishness, it seems, was not a birthright, but a color-coded gate. In education, the curriculum still omits much of empire's brutality. In media, black and brown Britons remain underrepresented.
Oh, yes.
Yet resistance grows. Movements like Black Lives Matter UK, Rhodes Must Fall, Oxford, and Colonies the curriculum demand not only recognition but transformation. Writers like Afua Hirsch, Akala, Rena Ida Lodge, and Satham Sanghera confront these questions head-on, challenging the nation to face its past without myth. Race in Britain is not just about immigration. It's about inheritance. The statues in city squares, the names of streets, the money and endowments, the assumptions and institutions. To move beyond racism, Britain must move beyond denial. Because empire didn't just shape others, shape the British self. And until that is fully understood, the ghosts of empire will remain not only in far-off lands, but in every British mirror. Empires take, they extract, enslave, destroy. And when they fall, they rarely clean up the wreckage. Instead, the burden of healing is left to the conquered. It requires restitution. But across the former British Empire, a new demand rises not for apology alone, but for reparations. Reparations are not charity. They are justice. They are the recognition that historic theft of land, labor, resources, and dignity requires more than words. From sugar to rum, Britain enriched itself on Jamaican soil while enslaving and brutalizing its people. Yet when slavery ended, the enslavers were compensated, not the enslaved. In the Caribbean, CARICOM Reparations Commission has outlined a 10-point plan calling on European nations, particularly Britain, to repair the lasting damage of slavery and colonialism. It was one of the largest bailouts in history. The last payments were made by British taxpayers in 2015, Black Britons. Many descendants of enslaved people helped pay off the debt of their ancestors' oppressors. The Benin bronzes, the Rosetta Stone, Tipu Sultan's sword, sacred Maori remains. Many of these sit behind glass in British museums. They were not gifts, they were loot. It deindustrialized local economies, caused famines through exploitative taxation and export policies, and left behind deeply unequal structures. Yet no formal reparative process has ever begun. Among the demands, debt cancellation, technology transfers, health initiatives, and formal apologies from the British monarchy and government. A full reparative process would mean rewriting those narratives, centering the voices of the colonized, funding historical research, reforming education systems. But the issue is not guilt, it is benefit. Britain continues to enjoy the wealth, global status, and institutions built on empire. The harm continues. So must the responsibility. They must begin with listening and end with action. In 2013, after mounting evidence and public pressure, the British government agreed to pay £20 million in compensation to just over 5,000 victims. But many argue this is a drop in the ocean. Soil was depleted. Biodiversity was lost. Food insecurity rose. And when drought came, the consequences were deadly. These were not acts of God. They were acts of governance. Gold from Ghana, diamonds from South Africa, coal from Bengal, oil from the Middle East, rubber from Malaysia, tin from Nigeria. These resources powered British industry but left local landscapes devastated and local communities disenfranchised. Jamaica alone estimates that Britain owes it billions for centuries of unpaid slave labor. National parks were created in Kenya and India, not for indigenous stewardship, but for elite British hunting or aesthetic pleasure. Local people were evicted in the name of preserving a nature they had lived with for centuries. Agriculture, mining, deforestation, and infrastructure were directed not by sustainability, but by extraction. The scars remain in ecosystems from Bengal to Botswana. In 1833, Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, and with it, the government paid today's equivalent of £17 billion to slave owners. That fact alone demands reckoning. In India, too, economists estimate that Britain extracted over $45 trillion during its rule. Meanwhile, former empires possessed the capital, the carbon history, and the policy influence to shape solutions. And until that legacy is confronted, any vision of a sustainable future will remain incomplete. In a reckoning with how imperial capitalism created the crises we now face, these forests were not for locals, but for imperial railways, shipbuilding, and export. It is imperial. They demand funding for adaptation, loss, and damage. They highlight the historic omissions of countries like Britain, whose early industrialization came at the cost of colonial resource use. The colonial state criminalized indigenous forest use, turning communities into trespassers on their ancestral lands. In Kenya, survivors of the MOH uprising, a brutal anti-colonial rebellion in the 1950s, fought for decades to hold Britain accountable for torture, rape, and detention in colonial camps. And what of the artifacts stolen from Africa, Asia, and the Americas? Britain resists returning them, claiming to preserve global heritage. But whose heritage is it, when the robbed cannot touch what was theirs? Reparations are also about truth. For centuries, British textbooks, monuments, and official history erased the violence of empire. Opponents claim reparations are impractical, that the past is too distant, that no one alive today bears guilt. Reparations need not be only financial. They can include land rights, institutional reform, and symbolic justice. But they must be real. Until reparations are addressed, the empire's legacy will remain an open wound bleeding history into the present. The British Empire did not just colonize people, it colonized nature. Forests, rivers, coastlines, and farmlands across the world were reshaped to serve imperial needs. In India, the British introduced commercial forestry, cutting down diverse native woodlands to plant monoculture timber crops like teak and sal. In Africa, The empire's obsession with cash, crops, cotton, coffee, cocoa, rubber transformed traditional agriculture. Famines in British-ruled India killed millions not due to natural scarcity, but because imperial trade policies exported food while people starved. The empire's resource extraction was immense. Even conservation, where it existed, served imperial interests. The colonial state treated nature as commodity. Rivers were dammed, animals hunted to near extinction. Indigenous ecological knowledge was dismissed as primitive. And today, these legacies haunt climate justice debates. Former colonies often suffer most from climate change through rising sea levels, deforestation, and heat waves. Yet they contributed least to the problem. This disparity is not accidental. At international climate summits, voices from the global south often call for climate reparations. But too often, these calls are delayed, diluted, or denied. True environmental justice must recognize historical responsibility. It must include land rights for indigenous communities, reparative green investments. Decolonizing the climate movement means shifting from control to collaboration, from extraction to restoration. Because the British Empire didn't just redraw borders, it redrew the planet's ecology. Empire was built not only through war and wealth, but through law. Legal systems were the empire's invisible machinery. They determined who was subject and who was sovereign, who could own land, who could speak, who could vote, who could belong. The British Nationality and Status of Aliens Act of 1914 created a legal category, British subject. A subject had obligations but rarely protections. They owed loyalty but received little in return. In the British Empire, citizenship was always conditional. At the height of its power, the empire ruled over hundreds of millions, yet few held full rights. Even after World War II, as former colonies gained independence, Britain retained legal levers to determine identity. The British Nationality Act of 1948 granted all people in the empire the status of citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies. But soon after, the door began to close. For a moment, the empire seemed to promise equality, and many believed it. With each new law, the definition of Britishness narrowed. What had once included the empire was now reserved for the metropole. British overseas territories like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands remain under UK jurisdiction, but their residents do not have full rights as UK citizens.
Ow.
Men and women from Jamaica, Nigeria, India, Pakistan, and beyond arrived in Britain as citizens invited to work, rebuild, and belong. It can liberate or confine. They were detained, denied healthcare, deported. Elderly citizens who had paid taxes for decades suddenly became strangers in their own homes. From constitutions to citizenship tests, the imperial blueprint still influences whose identity is considered valid. Immigrants are told to go back. Passport colors determine mobility. Colonial hierarchies echo in airport queues and visa decisions. The 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, the 1971 Immigration Act, the 1981 British Nationality Act. These laws did more than control borders. They reshaped lives. In the post-imperial era, it rules through influence, subtler, slicker, but still familiar. Families separated, residents denied status, entire generations thrown into legal limbo. The most infamous example, the Windrush scandal. Because the empire was not just about rule, it was about defining who had the right to be ruled and who had the right to rule. In the 2010s, under Britain's hostile environment policy, hundreds of legal residents, many who had lived in the UK since childhood, were declared illegal. To sound British is often to sound credible. Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, and others welcome thousands of international students every year, many from former colonies. Britain markets itself as a leader in global education. But this too carries hierarchy. The knowledge flows inward, and the tuition fees flow upward. All because they lacked paperwork the empire had never given them. Royal visits to the Caribbean, diplomatic missions in Africa, trade deals in Asia continue under the shadow of the former empire. And often, the language is unchanged. Partnership, mutual prosperity, shared heritage. It is a branding exercise, a legacy network that allows Britain to retain relevance in a world where it no longer leads economically or militarily. Former colonies are offered development funds, often with strings. British companies win contracts. British norms are embedded in governance programs. With offices in over 100 countries, it projects Britain as a hub of education, civility, and art. Its work is often positive, but its reach is imperial. This was no accident. It was the logical outcome of an imperial system that granted identity by Faverand, revoked it by law. With its departure from the European Union, Britain turned to its imperial past to find future markets. Global Britain became a slogan and echo of empire repackaged for modern diplomacy. Former colonies are cultivating South-South alliances, choosing Beijing or over London. Across the Commonwealth, similar contradictions persist. Some countries still recognize the British monarch as head of state. Others retain laws shaped by colonial codes. Britain, with its imperial toolkit, remains a master of it. Who belongs? Who decides? It is respected but also carries British editorial framing. What is emphasized? What is omitted? Who is the subject on? Who the object of the story? Citizenship, we are told, is neutral. But the empire taught otherwise, showed that law is a tool of inclusion and exclusion. Today, citizenship continues to be weaponized. Refugees are denied asylum, but it still walks familiar path, slayed during the age of empire, paved with shared language, elite connections, and institutional muscle. And as former colonies develop their own legal systems, the shadow of British law remains. Belonging, it turns out, is not a matter of origin. It is a matter of power. Till we reckon with how law has been used to police identity, we cannot claim justice. When Britain lowered its flags, it raised something else in their place: diplomacy. In the age of empire, Britain ruled through force. Welcome to the world of British soft power. Soft power is the ability to shape outcomes without coercion. It uses persuasion, culture, language, diplomacy, education. The British Council, founded in 1934, promotes English language learning and cultural exchange across the globe. The BBC World Service broadcasts in dozens of languages, delivering news to millions daily. In former colonies, BBC English still shapes perceptions of intelligence and authority. Universities, too, are part of the network. Diplomatically, Britain remains active across the Commonwealth. But whose heritage and who benefits? Military training, foreign aid, investment, and cultural outreach are now the tools of influence. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth remains a structure of symbolic unity with Britain always at the center. Its headquarters, London, its leadership, traditionally a British monarch. Critics argue that this is not a partnership of equals. Brexit amplified this dynamic, but many are pushing back. Leaders in the Caribbean are demanding reparations. African nations are asserting cultural sovereignty. Soft power cannot hide structural inequities forever. British diplomacy today wears a friendly face, so we must ask, when power becomes polite, is it any less imperial? In the ashes of empire, something curious was built: a family. The Commonwealth of Nations, as it is now known, emerged from the debris of colonial rule. A voluntary association, they say. 56 countries, spanning every continent. Tied not by coercion but by shared values: democracy, development, peace. An echo, a shape that looks suspiciously like empire reassembled. At least, that's the mission statement. India, South Africa, Jamaica, Pakistan, Nigeria, and others. Together, they represent over 2.5 billion people, nearly a third of humanity. Though the role is officially symbolic, the symbolism is heavy. After World War II, as decolonization swept across the globe, Britain sought to rebrand. Out went empire, came fraternity. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find something less benign. The Commonwealth's origins lie in 1931. With the Statute of Westminster, when Britain granted dominions like Canada and Australia autonomy, but kept them in the imperial orbit. Today, many of the world's former British colonies are members. But who leads this family? India, the most populous member, rarely engages with it politically. African states increasingly prioritize regional blocs. For some, Commonwealth membership is little more than ceremonial, useful for visas and trade, but hollow in meaning. The head of the Commonwealth, to this day, is the British monarch. not elected, not rotational, an inherited position. For many, its mere existence is a reminder of injustice packaged in diplomacy. Others say it must be dismantled entirely, that decolonization requires not just new words, but new structures. Or does it merely extend the rule by other means? It funds scholarships, cultural exchanges, and civil society projects. The Commonwealth Secretariat is headquartered in London. Most working groups, summits, and cultural initiatives orbit British institutions. Funding flows from the UK outward, influence flows back in. But empire began much closer to home. Each has its own story. Each has borne the weight of English expansionism, its militaries, its laws, its cultural suppression. Empire for them was not an abstract concept, it was domestic policy. The North remained in the United Kingdom a division that still sparks tension and violence today. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 brought peace, but the political wound remains fresh. Debates over republicanism have intensified. Monuments to colonial governors have fallen. The question is no longer if the monarchy will be removed, but when. British authorities criminalized tartan, banned bagpipes, and outlawed the Gaelic language. Culture itself became contraband. The Acts of Union in 1707 merged the Scottish and English parliaments after a century of battles, uprisings, and economic manipulation. Conquered by Edward I in the 13th century, it was slowly integrated into the English crown. The Welsh language was suppressed for centuries, banned in courts and mocked in schools. It survived underground in song and chapel. The result was close. The desire remains unresolved. While some elites gained, many Scots resisted. British landlords exported grain while the Irish starved. It was not simply neglect, it was policy. Supporters argue that the Commonwealth fosters cooperation in education, climate, trade, and gender rights. It hosts sporting events like the Commonwealth Games. Irish, Scottish, and Welsh regiments help build and defend the empire. Colonized, yes, but also colonizers. Questions about sovereignty, justice, and memory dominate political discourse. But critics see a different picture. The Commonwealth contains no formal mechanism for redressing colonial harm. No tribunal for land theft, slavery, or partition. No official fund for reparations. Invaded by the English crown in the 12th century, colonized in waves and subjected to centuries of dispossession, violence, and engineered famine. The Act of Union in 1801 formalized Ireland's annexation, but resistance never died. In Caribbean states like Barbados, Jamaica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, public sentiment is shifting. Others remain in the Commonwealth, but question its relevance. And still, the pageantry continues. Royal tours, commemorative stamps, protocol-laden summits, all under a banner that still bears imperial DNA. There's a name for this kind of arrangement. Soft hegemony, where the empire no longer rules but still presides. Can the Commonwealth be decolonized? Can it be transformed from a network of deference into one of true equity? Some say yes, but the institution is evolving. That its younger leaders, from Kenya to Trinidad, are pushing for reform. In the end, the Commonwealth is a question. Can something built from empire ever truly escape its origin? When we think of empire, we think of distant lands. Redcoats in India, sugar fields in Jamaica, gold mines in Ghana. Before the British Empire went global, it went internal. And its earliest colonies were not in Africa or Asia, but on the British Isles themselves, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. Take Ireland. The Irish famine of the 1840s, caused not by food shortage, but by imperial indifference, killed over 1 million and forced another 1 million to flee. In 1921, after a brutal war of independence, Ireland was partitioned. The South became a free state. Northern Ireland's troubles, a 30-year conflict born of colonial legacies, sectarian divisions, and unresolved sovereignty left thousands dead. Scotland, too, was brought into the Union by coercion and consolidation. The Highland clearances, the forced eviction of Gaelic-speaking clans in the 18th and 19th centuries, mirrored colonial land seizures abroad. Today, Scotland retains a strong sense of nationhood. Its parliament has devolved powers. And in 2014, it held a referendum on independence. Wales, often overshadowed, has its own history of resistance. Now, thanks to activists and educators, Welsh is on the rise. But the legacy of erasure is long. These internal colonies complicate Britain's identity. The very name United Kingdom of Great Britain in Northern Ireland contains contradiction. Unity through domination, diversity through conquest. And yet these nations were also made complicit in empire abroad. The tension is unresolved. Independence movements grow. Cultural revivals spread. So when Britain speaks of empire as something foreign, distant, or forgotten, remember this. The empire began at home, and until it reckons with its own domestic colonialism, its house remains built on borrowed ground. For centuries, Britain sailed out to the world, and when empire fell, the world came to Britain. Migration is not a modern crisis, it is a colonial consequence. The story of multicultural Britain is the story of empire reversing course. Nurses, train drivers, factory workers, clerks. They came not as outsiders, but as citizens of the empire. It is the return of the repressed, the colonized crossing the sea, once ruled by the colonizer. After World War II, Britain needed rebuilding. The empire's subjects, Africans, Caribbeans, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, were invited to fill labor shortages. The empire Windrush arrived in 1948, bringing hundreds from the Caribbean. More followed from Kenya, from Jamaica, from Trinidad, from India. They built the NHS. They cleaned the streets, taught in schools. They laid the bricks of modern Britain. South Asians brought curry shops, sari shops, corner stores, and cricket clubs. Africans brought churches, high life, and hair salons. Brexit, fueled in part by anti-immigrant sentiment, reignited empire nostalgia. Refugees from conflicts Britain helped to create or abandon. As borders shifted globally, identities shifted at home. But beneath the veneer, tensions simmered. They are both product and critic of a country that does not always see them as its own. London became Lagos. Birmingham became Bombay. Bradford became a global village. But what met them was not welcome, it was resistance. The question is whether Britain can belong to all of them. In housing, employment, and policing, they were treated as other. Neighborhoods became battlegrounds. No blacks, no dogs, no Irish was not just graffiti, it was social policy. It was never truly about indigenous health. It was about preserving the machinery of empire. Riots flared in Notting Hill, in Brixton, in Toxteth. It was also about hierarchy. Empire brought with it a specific view of the body, racialized, categorized, controlled. Eugenics took root in British universities and filtered into colonial policy. Slave hospitals documented deaths and diseases, rarely treating their root causes. After emancipation, black health was neglected and disparities persisted. Colonial medical hierarchies, doctors at the top, nurses as subordinates, traditional healers dismissed, remain intact. Rural clinics are underfunded. Urban hospitals mirror Western models ill-suited for local needs. Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. South Asians face higher rates of heart disease. Structural racism in healthcare leads to misdiagnoses, undertreatment, and implicit bias. The idea that some races were biologically inferior was used to excuse inequality. Many were frontline workers, nurses, drivers, cleaners. Their deaths were a direct result of centuries of inequality, magnified by crisis. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech in 1968 declared them invaders. They disrupted traditional practices, criminalized indigenous healing, and framed colonial authorities as saviors, if when the very conditions of disease were created by imperial exploitation, to keep laborers healthy enough to work, but not empowered to question, to study the colonized body not to understand, but to dominate. Doctors from Nigeria, India, and Pakistan migrate to fill NHS shortages, often leaving their own health systems understaffed. This brain drain is not accidental, it is systemic. And yet they stayed. They created. Today, justice must treat it as a site of dignity. Caribbean migrants gave Britain ska, reggae, and dub poetry. It means valuing indigenous knowledge, respecting patient autonomy, addressing the social roots of disease, poverty, racism, and displacement. Multiculturalism was not a gift from the state, It was a survival strategy by migrants. Prisoners were injected, children were measured, cataloged, and dissected in the name of racial science. The 1980s saw new waves from Somalia, from Sri Lanka, from Hong Kong. By the 21st century, Britain declared itself proudly multicultural. The 2012 London Olympics celebrated diversity. TV ads showed hijabs and saris, school curriculums tiptoed into black history, the hostile environment policy, the Windrush deportations, Grenfell Tower, stop and search, rising Islamophobia. For many migrants and their descendants, Britishness remains conditional. Citizenship granted, but belonging withheld. Yet their presence reshapes the nation. In parliament, in music, in art, in sports, in literature, the children of empire now lead. Migration is framed as a problem, but it is a mirror. It reflects back Britain's history, its hypocrisy, and its hope. The empire came home, and it brought its people with it. The question now is not whether they belong, the white coat, the stethoscope, the clinical chart symbols of care and science. But in the empire, medicine was never just about healing. Colonial medicine was a tool of governance. It was designed to protect settlers, not subjects. In British India, tropical medicine emerged as a discipline focusing on diseases that affected Europeans in hot climates. Quarantines, vaccination programs, and sanitation drives were often imposed without consent. In Africa, British colonial doctors ran experiments on black bodies testing vaccines, trialing procedures, often without ethical standards. Women were sterilized. These practices were not fringed, they were mainstream. Imperial science helped justify racial hierarchies. In the Caribbean, plantation medicine evolved to manage enslaved laborers, made for their welfare, but for economic efficiency. The legacy endures. Across the former empire, health systems built by Britain still dominate. Meanwhile, the global south continues to serve the global north. In Britain itself, racial disparities in health outcomes are stark. During the COVID-19 pandemic, ethnic minorities in Britain were disproportionately affected. And yet, Western medicine continues to frame itself as neutral, apolitical, objective. But science is not neutral when it ignores its colonial past. Health is not equal when history is unhealed. Decolonizing medicine means more than diversity and staffing. Empire treated the body as a site of control. The clinic, like the courtroom, must reckon with its imperial ghosts. Only then can it truly heal. Empire was built with guns and laws, but it was challenged with fire, with voice, with dreams. Across the British Empire, colonized people did not accept subjugation passively. They resisted, they organized, they rose. Their stories are not footnotes, they are the backbone of history. From the 1857 revolt, what British textbooks called the Mutiny, to Gandhi's non-violent campaigns, to Bhagat Singh's martyrdom, to the Quit India movement of 1942. The people demanded sovereignty, not just with speeches, but with sacrifice. It followed decades of mass arrests, brutal crackdowns, famines under colonial policy, and partition scars. But it became a beacon for other movements. In India, resistance took many forms. India's independence in 1947 was not granted, it was wrestled. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah declared independence in 1957 at long last. As the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from British chains, in Trinidad, Claudia Jones, deported from the U.S., fought for immigrant rights and founded what would become Notting Hill Carnival. Kikuyu rebels were tortured, detained in camps, executed. For years, Britain denied the atrocities. Spiritual, symbolic, everyday. Only in the 2010s, after survivors sued, the UK government acknowledged and compensate victims. But the legacy remains. In Kenya, the Momo uprising of the 1950s challenged British settler rule. In Jamaica, Marcus Garvey rallied global black pride. "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery," he declared. In Nigeria, unionists and intellectuals mobilized against colonial labor abuses and demanded home rule. In Hong Kong, today's protesters evoke colonial contracts to challenge new oppressors. Empire lingers in, so does resistance. But each moment of resistance chipped away at the myth of British benevolence. These were not isolated rebellions, were part of a tidal wave.
From Malaya to Malawi, Sudan to Singapore, British colonies demanded their due. But in the margins of textbooks, on the walls of village homes, in the hearts of elders, they live on. But resistance wasn't always armed.
It was cultural through banned languages, secret songs, ancestral rituals. It was educational through underground schools, radical newspapers, oral traditions. The past, cast in bronze. Winston Churchill is lionized in Parliament Square, though his policies contributed to the Bengal famine and upheld racist views. Queen Victoria sits atop thrones and fountains across former colonies, her image untouched by the rebellions she inspired. Women led, children protested, artists painted, dancers encoded memory into movement, and even after independence, the struggle continued. Against neocolonialism, against economic dependency, against puppet governments installed by departing imperial powers. In South Africa, Britain left behind apartheid infrastructure, took decades of global solidarity, internal uprising, and unbreakable will to defeat it. But often, they tell only one side, the colonizer's voice preserved, the colonized voice dismissed. In Zimbabwe, war against settler rule was prolonged and bloody. A mask becomes art, not evidence. Sword becomes craftsmanship, not violence. It is important to say, not all rebellions succeeded. Many were crushed, names forgotten, songs silenced. But empire, often a footnote. The statue fell into the river, where so many of his victims once lay in chains. Some called it vandalism, others called it justice. These stories are rarely taught in British schools. It's not only for who they honor, but for who they exclude. Because empire did not fall by itself. It was pushed. And those who pushed must not be forgotten. History is not what happened, is what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. Walk through the streets of London, and you will see them. Statues of generals, plaques to empire builders, streets named after merchants and monarchs. But what kind of past? Cecil Rhodes stands high in Oxford, though he plundered southern Africa and laid the groundwork for apartheid. These monuments do not teach history, they narrate power. In Bristol, a crowd toppled the statue of Edward Colston, slave trader glorified for his philanthropy. Across the world, statues are being questioned. Where are the monuments to the enslaved, the revolutionaries, the resistors? Why are there so few memorials for the millions who died in famines, forced marches, concentration camps, and massacres under British rule? The British Empire left behind libraries, museums, and archives. The British Museum is filled with looted objects, yet its labels rarely mention conquest. It is not simply what is displayed, but how it is displayed. In education, the story is the same. British children learn of the Industrial Revolution, the two world wars, and the glories of exploration. Decolonizing memory means more than removing statues. It means rethinking narrative. It means questioning the curriculum, diversifying the archive, supporting scholarship from the Global South, funding community museums, listening to oral histories. It means understanding that memory is a political act. Some argue we should preserve history, but whose history, and at what cost? Monuments are not neutral. They are messages across time. They tell us who matters, who belonged, who won. Today, a new generation is rewriting those messages. They're painting murals, writing poetry, reclaiming land, building monuments to memory that do not glorify conquest, but honor resistance. Britain stands at a crossroads. It can continue to polish its myth soar. It can face its past in full. To remember differently is to imagine differently. And in that imagination lies the future. The flags are gone. The colonies are independent. The empire, we are told, is over. But what if it never ended? What if it simply changed its clothes? The most enduring legacy of the British Empire is not cultural or symbolic. It is structural. An architecture of systems, legal, economic, linguistic, institutional, that continues to shape the modern world. We call it globalization, but its skeleton is imperial. British tax havens still house trillions. British law firms mediate international contracts. British banking norms frame regulation worldwide. Consider the global financial system. The dominance of the pound sterling once gave way to the dollar, but many of its mechanisms were born in the city of London. British-trained judges sit on benches from the Caribbean to Hong Kong. Arbitration centers in London resolve disputes between corporations and sovereign states. Development paradigms shaped by imperial logics still dictate economic policy. Aid flows with conditions. Immigration is policed with criteria inherited from racial hierarchies. Consider the global legal order. Common law, exported by empire, forms the foundation of jurisprudence in over 80 countries. Consider the language. English remains the dominant tongue of diplomacy, trade, academia, science, and the internet. In the UN Security Council, where Britain holds veto power, the IMF and World Bank, shaped by former colonial priorities. In global media narratives where British accents signal authority, activists call for reparations, not as symbolic gestures, but as restructuring demands. Artists tell stories that undo imperial myth. It's not because of natural evolution, but because of colonial force. Consider the global elite. Political leaders, CEOs, diplomats, many trained at British institutions. The Oxbridge stamp opens doors from Nairobi to New Delhi to Nassau. Former colonial rulers now mentor their former subjects. Power circulates, not disappears. But you can trace it in a courtroom, in a trade deal, in a curriculum, in a courtroom oath, in a shipping contract, in a passport queue. And consider the global order itself. Borders drawn by Britain still fuel conflict. Its legacy is not a ghost. It is a structure. We've heard how a single empire rewrote the fate of continents, how it reshaped economies, silenced languages, and redefined belonging. A map etched into law, into culture, into memory. Britain no longer rules an empire, but the world still runs on rules it helped write often for its own benefit. This is the invisible empire. It's the one you can't point to on a map. It is embedded in international institutions. The British Empire laid the groundwork for a world order that still centers the West even as it claims to be post-colonial. But recognition is growing. Scholars speak of coloniality, not just colonialism, way of being and ordering the world that outlives political domination. The invisible empire depends on forgetting. It requires us to believe that the past is past. But if we see clearly, we realize we're still living in its echo. The empire may have named nations, but it could never erase their souls. How they built nations, revived cultures, and challenged narratives. How they demanded justice, not just through words but through action, law, art, and truth. The question is no longer, did empire end? The question is, will we end its shadow? The British Empire is gone on paper, but in reality, it lingers in the air we breathe, the institutions we trust, the borders we cross, the hierarchies we inherit. Across 25 chapters, we've journeyed from colonial battlefields to classrooms, from cricket pitches to courtrooms, from sugar fields to tax havens. But we have also seen something else. Resistance, reclamation, refusal. We've seen how colonized peoples refused silence. The story of empire is not just about conquest. It's about the courage to unlearn, to question, to rebuild. Britain stands at a reckoning. Will it continue to romanticize its imperial past? Or will it confront it fully, truthfully, unapologetically? For the rest of the world, the reckoning is already here. In the protests for reparations, in the toppling of statues, in the revision of textbooks, in the decolonizing of minds, and the refusal to forget. This is not about blame. It's about recognizing that history lives in, that healing requires honesty. The British Empire was vast, but the human will is greater. And so we leave you with this. The next time you walk past a statue, speak a language, trust the law, cross a border, read a book, or open a passport, ask yourself, whose world are you living in, and whose world do you want to build? Because the empire is not only behind us, it's within us. No, and so is the power to end it.